Hey y'all, it's Stephen Van Kampen-Lewis, back here in my dining room, and I'm here to talk about the second part of my Brazilian trip, which finished up this month. And we left the area where Cattleya nobilior variety Amalii lives and is from, and we drove south. We drove southeast for, probably at least a half day. And we ended up staying in the town of Diamantina as our sort of home base for the forays into the Rupiculous Laelia or Rupiculous Cattleyas areas. And we visited a couple of those areas. And but before I talk about those areas, I want to say that the town of Diamantina is like 400 years old, and it was founded by colonial Portuguese folks, and so there's a lot of really cool architecture. It's still cobblestone streets, and it's like on the side of this insanely steep hill. So it's really cool. And in the video after this, I'll talk about the fun adventures that we had that were not orchid related, and Diamantina will be part of that discussion. But here in a moment, I'll show you again. I'll do kind of a Google Earth zoom in, where we look at the rough area of where these plants are found. The Rupiculous Cattleyas are more common than Amalii is. So I probably don't have to be as cautious with this group, since, like I said, they are more common. They have a much larger area that they inhabit, but still, I'm not super excited about disclosing exactly where we were, but I'll show you some useful Google Earth imagery that shows you kind of the approximate area where we're at. And this area is actually even much more hilly, more mountainous. So there's actually, it's similarly difficult to find them based on the rough geography and the basic area that I'm going to talk to you about. So, but again, I want to give you enough information about the natural habitat of these plants so that you can become a better grower and really get to see some cool, fascinating in situ photos, but without being able to, tip off the poachers so they can go in and clean things out, even if it's only regionally. I doubt very much that the poachers would be able to come in and clean out all these areas, because like I said, these are large areas that these species inhabit. Still, I do want to be cautious. That said, like I said, I'll do a Google Earth sort of zoom through. We'll talk about the Rupiculous Cattleyas themselves, and we went to several different areas, and we found different species. And then at the end, I'll talk about the other species that we found. In fact, there were way more orchid species growing on the ground alongside these Rupiculous Cattleyas than there were in the Cattleya nobilior variety Amalii habitat. In the Amalii habitat, we had, like, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 species, and I think I only talked about 2 in the previous video. This time, there are many different genera, a whole lot of different species. I think there was probably only 2 or 3 that we saw actually blooming. I'm sorry, actually, I'll talk about the Constantia christini. So that's some other species that were blooming. And so this will be, you'll see a lot more flowers in this particular video. Anyway, I'm babbling. Let's do the Google Earth fly through and then show you some photos and videos of the actual Rupiculous Cattleyas and the other orchids that are their neighbors. All right, so I have us zoomed out here showing what is most of South America, and you can see a large chunk of that South America is Brazil, of course. That's where we were. And of course we were in the southeast area. And of course, originally we flew into Sao Paulo, then we flew north to Brasilia, and then we ended up driving northeast. Now I've got Taguatinga here as the Amalii locality. That's not where we actually stayed or hunted for orchids, but that is the type locality for Amalii. So it is really one of the only publicly available points. So I'm just going to say that we were in that area so that we're not giving away any new locations. And if you're a poacher, good luck. But anyway, so we drove down to Diamantina, and as you can see, there's that 2,000 foot sort of plateau that was above us. So we couldn't really just drive east at all. We had to go straight south, and these are all on the back roads of Brazil, and then go over some really rugged terrain. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, and you're going to see lots of hills, lots of mountains. This is a very mountainous area, and so we had to cross over that, and then we ended up staying in Diamantina, and that's that's the 400-year-old town surrounded by mountains, and on the side of a huge hill, or I guess the side of mountains, and that was where we stayed for a couple days while we were exploring the Rupiculous Cattleyas, and then we would venture off into one mountain range or mountain or another that was nearby, and each mountainous area pretty much had its own sort of group of Rupiculous Cattleyas. So worth noting actually is that Cattleya rupestris was common just about everywhere. And here I'm zooming in on Diamantina itself, and that's again, I'll probably highlight that on the next video, and you can see it's very steep here, big hills. The roads there are really interesting to go up and down. You got to have great brakes because you're riding your brakes quite a bit, especially as you're getting into the old part of town, which is where we stayed. We stayed at one of the older hotels. It was actually built in the 1960s, but anyway, so this is our jumping off point for where we get the videos and photos. And so we drove south from Diamantina and on dirt roads that looked a lot like this, and this was our first stop. This is what the habitat looks like for Cattleya brigeri and kleberi. And so we realized that we would be walking across this type of terrain to look for these two species in this particular spot. And the first flower that we actually came upon looked a lot like brigeri, but it was on a very short spike. So there's a good chance that this was actually a hybrid between brigeri and kleberi. And the reason that I say that is because the spike was so short, which is indicative of kleberi, and it was blooming out of season for brigeri. So, and that was really the only one that we found that looked like brigeri. And here's an interesting quick video showing more about the habitat and sort of the situation that you find these plants in. And basically, they're growing alongside cactus and other orchids that you see in the bottom of the image there, but in very, very shallow pans of sand with almost no sand associated with them at all. It's like they're mostly clinging to the rocks themselves. And then we started noticing the blooming kleberi over and over and over, and it was just this amazing show, of course, of these very bright yellow Rupiculous Cattleyas, and actually you might notice that the yellow is more of a pale yellow compared to that brigeri or brigeri hybrid that we started with. So the flowers are a little smaller, the plants are smaller, and the inflorescence is also smaller. And you can see that these are growing amongst grasses and other small forbs. And so to help everybody at home who's trying to grow this species, I wanted to make this video to show you what type of media these Rupiculous Cattleyas are growing in. I mentioned a shallow clay pan, or excuse me, a shallow rock pan, and it's got that's quartz sand, and then I'm moving around there. And so these are just growing in a little bit of sand attached to the rock, and that's about it. And these little pans do hold some water during the rainy season. So, and you can see that here too as well. So if you're trying to grow these, don't grow them in wood, grow them in sand in a clay pot. And you can see that this was a little one that was just throwing up a spike there, or is about to. You can see the sort of shadow in the sheath right there. Again, showing the shallow nature of the pan. And of course, that's Francisco photographing one of these clebri, so you get to see sort of a size comparison of the flowers and the plants compared to a human. And so here's a few more habitat shots showing just how grassy and rocky these areas are. And you can see a person there on the top right, just showing sort of a size comparison of where we were at. And of course, there's lots of orchids that are not these Cattleyas. In fact, I'll show some right now. This is Epidendrum denticulatum. This is a very bright colored epi, as you can see. Very small flowers, but really intensely colored, and just a super cool little species, of course, with a long epidendrum style spike. And we saw a ton of Bifrenaria therianthina, I think I pronounced that correctly, but these were growing in the same conditions and alongside the Rupiculous Cattleyas, and may have actually been more common than the Cattleyas themselves. And again, you can see that they're growing in the same sort of rocky, super rocky habitat with very shallow, thin layer of sand all around them. And I looked these ones up online, and they look like they have really cool blooms. So I'm gonna have to grab one of these if I see one for sale. The next one that we saw was Pleurotalus teres, and they were very abundant actually, and kind of a little bit difficult to tell between the two, between the Rupiculous Cattleyas and the Pleurotalus, because they did look very similar actually. And we did find actually a pretty big clump of one of the terrestrial species of Certipodium. As you can see from the photos, we couldn't tell what they were. There's a couple different species, and when they're leafless and not in bloom, they're pretty tough to tell apart. But you can see these were growing in an area where there was a lot more of the quartz cobble. So I suspect this area might hold a little bit more water during the rainy season. But it was a pretty good clump of them actually, and sort of an unexpected find that we all really enjoyed. And we were actually walking back to the car when we saw this group. And this is just a fun video we saw tons of seed pods, and so I was helping to get the next generation out of the seed pod and out into the world, and you can see just how fine and tiny these orchid seeds really are. And I don't want to spend too much time on a single day, but we did see these gallery forests, which are these sort of these forested areas in these valleys that are collecting water during the rainy season. And we went down into them specifically to look for Cattleya bicolor to see if they were there. And Francisco's been coming to these spots for decades, and he's actually never gone into the gallery forest. And so we walked in, as you can see in this photo here, or this video here, and there were just orchids everywhere. We didn't see any Cattleya bicolor, or one of the Laelias is also in here, and I forget which one we were looking for. It may have been Prestans or Syncarana, I can't remember. But we ended up seeing 3 different species of Maxillaria. We saw a couple of Bulbophyllums actually. In fact, Francisco is pointing to some blooming Maxillarias, and he was absolutely blown away by the diversity. You know, we're in the same area, we just happen to have trees, and there's just tons and tons and tons of orchids. It was really cool and unexpected. And just to sort of drive home the point, we saw these branches just dripping with orchids. And for those of you who like philodendrons, we found these. As far as I can tell, this is an unknown species, or maybe an undescribed species, or just something that I was unable to find online. And so the next day, we went to a different habitat. We drove northwest of Diamantina, and our goal was to find Cattleya rupestris in bloom, and maybe some Cattleya bradii. Not entirely sure, but this was the scene that we were greeted with. As you can see, you know, we were pretty high up in elevation, so the vegetation looked fairly similar. It was similarly rocky, with thin, sandy soils and lots of cacti, lots of spiky, different bromeliads, maybe Hectia or Dickia. I'm not entirely sure, but that was the road coming in, and that was where we were hunting for the day, and we were not disappointed. There were a ton of really cool things to see, including blooming Cattleya rupestris everywhere. As you can see, the purple of those flowers really stands out against the dark rocks and some of the grasses, and there's Francisco, of course, photographing some, a good-sized clump. And so rupestris is everywhere. My understanding is that a lot of these different types of habitats have different composition of Cattleyas or Rupiculous Cattleyas, but rupestris, for whatever reason, just seems to be everywhere, and it's incredibly abundant and just so really cool to look at. You can see that one growing next to some bromeliads. But it grows in the grass, it grows in the rocks, it grows exposed, it grows, in the sand. I guess that's sort of the one thing that ties all of these together is they really are growing on rocks. And sometimes they have sand, and sometimes they're in the cracks. And sometimes they have grass growing with them, but they're pretty exposed. And they really seem to thrive, as you can see. I mean, these are just tons and tons of these. You can see them from far away, and walking up to them is really easy. And there were a few different color varieties. Like we saw this semi-alba, and unfortunately that's not a great shot, but the next one is better. And then my personal favorite was this incredibly dark one. I absolutely love this one. I just couldn't get enough of that particular plant. And then here's just a couple of quick movies where we kind of zoom in on the habitat, and you can see again the sandiness that they're growing in, the exposed nature. And what's cool about rupestris is actually you can see there's sort of a blue sheen on the leaves. It's very similar to Laelia digbyana. If you've grown that one in very bright light, it gets this sort of gray-blue coloring to the leaves, and that's probably a sunscreen. And we see it quite a bit on the rupestris, but not necessarily on the other plants. And there are tons of seed pods, just seed pods as far as the eye can see. And these cactus with the blue fruit, they're kind of cool as well. They were growing alongside these very often also. And so, it's a very vigorous species, creating the next generation all over the place. Tons of adults, tons of, young, juvenile, and baby plants, and then tons and tons of seed pods were set. And of course, the other thing that we were looking for was Cattleya bradii. And we saw a lot of bradii, none in bloom, but you can see it's a much smaller plant. The plants themselves tend to be this bright red. In fact, you can see rupestris there is taller and blue, and then you see bradii there is short and red. So the next thing we were on the hunt for was on the side of rocks, and we had to scramble up these rocks. And we actually had to go up higher in elevation to find them. And here's a picture of me at the top of some rocks looking backwards. And what we were looking for was one of the smallest genera in the Laelia, which is Constantia christini, which is this teeny tiny little Cattleya relative that Francisco Miranda himself described. And these things are tiny. So this was an absolutely gigantic clump of Constantia christini. So as you can imagine, finding these things is really, really difficult. And here in a second, you'll see Constantia next to my finger, just showing the size difference. So the blooms themselves are pretty much the same size as the plants, actually. And then this photo here is actually one of my favorites. This is a zoomed in shot. I'm pretty sure Chris took this, but I really want you to focus in on that lip and see the detail of the calli, which are multiple calluses, right? There in the lip, and there's some teeny tiny creature out there that really just has to pollinate these and must be absurdly small. Finally, here's a quick video showing you a big, massive clump clinging to the side of the rocks. And this is probably the most extreme environment of anything we've seen because there's no possible way that any moisture is being trapped at all. These guys dry off almost instantly. And believe it or not, there is a Constantia that's even smaller. As you can imagine, it's called Constantia microphylla. And Constantia microphylla, believe it or not, grows in the same area as Macroscopica, but is like half the size. And there's a photo there of Francisco getting a zoomed in shot of one of those microphyllas. And this is actually a species, another species that he described. So there's got to be just something out there that's pollinating these. And boy, if these were hybridizing, how would we ever know? You know, finding the plants is nearly impossible. Finding the flowers is even harder. And of course, as you can imagine, there were non-Laelianae in the area. Again, we have this bifrenaria growing next to some of the Rupiculous Cattleyas. And then we had Bulbophyllum adiamentinum, which was only described in 2020. And these things are just as small as Constantia. In fact, I initially confused them for Constantia when I first saw them. And this is an absolutely enormous clump, as you'll see with my finger next to it. And this is a species that was actually only described in 2020. And I have to say, we didn't see them blooming, so this might not have even been a diamantinum. This could have been something completely different that is undescribed. We don't know. There definitely needs to be more research in this part of Brazil. All right, and for the third and final day of the Rupiculous Cattleyas journey, we drove northeast, actually pretty far. It took us about 4 hours one direction. In fact, by the time we got home, it was dark and we were kind of freaking out. But we went higher up in the mountains and into a more mountainous area, as you can see in this photo here. And then actually, we crossed a really big river, which was the first sort of major water feature that we've seen. So that was really cool. And, I'm a fish nerd as well, so I wanted to get in the water and poke around. But of course, we didn't have time. And I'm sure there would have been a whole different suite of orchids along this river if we had sort of followed it. But this is the habitat. So this is higher up in the mountains. You can see there's much more spikiness. These are all, if this was Texas, I would say those are Hectea or Dickia, but they're just super spiky bromeliads. And we were searching for Cattleya mirandi, which is what Chris is zooming on there. It's a super bright orange Cattleya, absolutely beautiful. And of course, there's lots of rupestris around as well. And so as you can imagine, for bright orange flowers, they were fairly easy to find, but they were not nearly as numerous as rupestris was. And this is an interesting species because they're sort of in more protected areas. They tend to be underneath grasses or in deep rocky cracks. It seems like they're fewer and farther between. They're larger plants, the largest Cattleyas or Rupiculous Cattleyas that we've seen. And then they have these intensely, brilliantly orange flowers atop these really, really long spikes. As you can imagine, for a species that needs to bloom well above the grass and trees and shrubs that it grows in and amongst. And here's a quick video showing the habitat, as well as a plant in bloom. And we start at the top of the plant where you can see the flowers, and then slowly move down towards the base of the plant, so you can get a better idea of what the plant looks like, as well as what the habitat that it's growing looks like. And here we have again another blooming plant, and actually a couple of blooming plants with a sort of landscape photo showing again a little bit more detail of the habitat. And of course, there were some other orchids worth noting, including this Bulbophyllum wenzelii. Unfortunately, we saw a bunch of big clumps, but no blooms this time. We did see some seed pods on a few, and just looking them up online that looks like they're really cool species. This one has a new growth coming in, despite it being the deepest, darkest part of the dry season. That one's still well along in its growth, and actually you can see some of those seed pods right here. Encyclia, a single Encyclia duvenii, and you can see the flowers here. It's just kind of an interesting species, and this is a high elevation, so we were not expecting, at least I was not expecting, to see what kind of looks like a low elevation Encyclia up here. And this one actually had seed pods on it in addition to flowers. The seed pods were a really cool sort of sparkly black color. I thought I'd gotten a picture of the pod, but I guess not. Instead, I just got this photo, or I should say this video of this sort of large clump here. And it shows what the habit looks like of the plant itself, the flowers, the area that it's located in. It's lots of brush. And finally, the last interesting thing that we saw was this intergeneric Prosthecea by Encyclia hybrid. This is one that Francisco was pretty excited about. He was absolutely sure it was this natural intergeneric hybrid. I can't remember exactly how he figured that out. He just said it looked vegetatively somewhere in between the two genera. So he knew what it was, and he thought it was pretty exciting. But anyway, I want to wrap this one up. This one's getting a little long in the tooth, and feel free to ask me questions and let me know if there's anything that else you want to see. I think for the next video, I will simply show some of the non-orchid things we saw some birds and lizards in a humongous cave, and a little bit of Diamantina, that 400-year-old town, and a few other cool things that we got to do. Anyway, hope you're having a great weekend. Talk to you later. Bye.